Today we're chatting with Miss Beatrice Leong. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Bea?
So my name is Beatrice. I am content creator and media and a documentary filmmaker. I'm also an entrepreneur, and most recently I've been doing a lot of advocacy for autistic rights, especially for women.
You were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, at the age of 36. That's rather late in the day for a diagnosis. Why do you think it took so long to be diagnosed?
I got diagnosed with autism very late in life to a lot of people. It didn't mean that I developed autism. I've always had it, but I think it was missed, or maybe because awareness was very low back then, and a lot of my challenges and difficulties that I had during childhood and school years was misconstrued as something else. Generally, also there is some form of a lack of data to show that women or girls also have autism. Their challenges are more inwards. So I did grow up with a lot of mental health difficulties. I didn't have a good time in school. Also because I'm a very verbal person, so I didn't lose my verbal ability. A lot of children, where they regress and they tend to not be able to communicate by speaking, so I didn't lose that, but my communication challenges came about very differently. That's why it didn't get picked up. And then as I grew up, then a lot of the meltdowns that had happened, it was seen as something else, simply because we don't know enough about girls having autism or women having autism. And also because when we tend to see doctors or when we get sick, you only go and see it when you're in a crisis point. So you get missed out. People are not putting it together over what had happened. So by the time I got started being able to work with someone who can finally hear what I'm saying, it was very challenging also for that person. But the great part that came out of that relationship with that therapist was that he was able to at least stuck through many years to put all of this together and then refer me out to a neuropsychologist who was then be able to rule so many things out, and finally something makes sense. So that's how I got my diagnosis. And my journey is very chaotic. It takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, very expensive. And there's actually no support for adults as well, especially if you're female. You're dealing with a very, very complex layer of how women are being perceived in the medical field. And when we look at the medical side of things, the understanding, a lot of the data are derived from testing and research being done on white male, and that's how my diagnosis came by very late. And even after getting the diagnosis, it wasn't like a magic thing that solved everything. It gave an understanding, and even then I went through a period of even doubting and wondering, hang on, is this really it? I got my official diagnosis when I was 36. I've understood myself a lot more. I've coped better, but it doesn't mean I don't have bad times. And last year had been very, very challenging, and it got to a point where I start to wonder, this many years after the first diagnosis, am I really sure? And I actually went through the process again. This will be a constant challenge, even within myself, to really wonder, am I or am I not? And autism is so unique that way because it is a medical diagnosis, but it's a mental health management. So it takes time for you to actually really understand a diagnosis for each person. And every person is different.
In June of 2022, you founded an autistic-led advocacy group, Autism Inclusiveness Direct Action Group, or AIDA for short. How does AIDA help individuals on the autism spectrum, and what do you hope to achieve through AIDA?
I've always been very, very vocal, a huge advocate for mental health to begin with. I was never shy about talking about my therapy journey. I think being from the creative sector, I get a lot of opportunity to be able to voice out, speak out, and I've always been that person anyway. And then when I started learning about autism, I started talking to a lot of different people. I was seeking for information out of Malaysia because there's very, very limited resources within the country. I started talking to people in the US and Australia, looking for women's group, engaging with trauma specialists from the US. And I realized that the gap in knowledge is so wide. We are still using methodologies that other countries have ruled out. So I started doing a lot of advocacy, and because I was so public about it, I got a lot of opportunities to write, to talk, to advocate, and people started coming to me for pathway. I think I have become somewhat of a repository of knowledge. I've also connected with a lot more women. I realized that they can no longer be just Beatrice talking about it, because when Beatrice talks about it, it becomes just my story. Each of this 350,000, it's one story of its own, and it's a problem that's larger than we think it is. So AIDA started that way. I wanted to start to consolidate all the efforts that I've been doing, and when I had my diagnosis, I also realized how difficult the journey had been. Information were not there, no tools were available. I'm a huge proponent of technology and IoTs. I believe in this whole data and AI. It had helped me. I've been putting together a startup to build a digital companion tool to help people on the diagnosis journey. And it's not just for autism, it's also for parents who don't know where to go, because information are not structured. And all this could be automated. There's so much that we can do with data. And also, when do we deliver information to someone? You don't want to overwhelm someone, because it's really overwhelming. And AIDA was created to be a support, the social impact side of it.
You mentioned earlier about 1% of the population might be on the autism spectrum. Are there any actual figures?
By WHO standard, the prevalence of autism is at 1%, and that's a very conservative number, although some people have believed that it's almost to 4% of the world population. In Malaysia, our latest data show 1 in 658 person. The gap in the data is very, very wide. Perhaps it's also because how we derive this number from. Maybe we are only looking at whoever who's registered with an OKU card, and we know that a lot of people don't want to have an OKU card, so you don't get the data. And then also people who are misdiagnosed. There are real situations also where parents don't want the autism diagnosis. They hear it, they know it, they manage it as it is, but they don't want the diagnosis written down. So it's being written as a learning difficulty. We are not there yet in terms of acceptance. It's improving. At least now people understand. People know the word ASD and they recognize the word autism.
When you have a child, at some point you will think, oh, something's not quite right. What advice would you give these parents?
We all want the best for our loved ones, and especially for our children. So we hope for the best that they could be in life. When we see our child different from the others, we then become afraid. Not for the child, but we are afraid of what's next. So they avoid getting a diagnosis. They avoid seeing a problem. The denial is very, very high, and that says a lot over the landscape of our country. We don't really have much of a pathway. We don't recognize the different people on the spectrum. Our society is not so inclusive yet. Of course, you can't cure autism, but the sooner that you can help a child learn tools, coping mechanism, learning how to advocate for themselves, and that's so important, giving them tools to be able to communicate. It's never too late, but you could have helped them cope before they have to interact with a larger society, and that's generally when the problem is as well.
If you could go back in time, what would you do differently?
I don't think I would have changed a single thing. Sure, there may be certain things which I think could have been dealt with better, but I don't think my parents would have known any better. I don't think school would have known any better. If I hadn't gone through what I've had, I don't think I would have this insight. All things considered, I live a fantastic life, and at least I could turn around and say that no, don't do this, because I went through a horrible time like that, and I can tell you that this doesn't work. And also because I need to write a book, so I need the stories of my book, so I don't want to change a single thing.